In front of 50 guests, my son's voice sliced through the air like a whip. "Shut up! Don't embarrass me!" His finger was stabbing toward me, as if I were some beggar who had wandered in by mistake. My cheeks burned under the yellow glow of the chandelier. Laughter rippled around the long dining table, forced and nervous, like people didn't know whether to side with him or look away. The clink of cutlery stopped. Glasses froze mid-air. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, louder than any sound in that room. At the head of the table, the billionaire, the reason for this entire performance, slowly pushed back his chair. The scrape against the marble floor was sharp, heavy. Everyone's eyes followed him, but mine stayed locked on my son's face, twisted with panic and pride. I want to pause here, because what came next still shakes me. And if you want to hear how this night turned my world upside down, subscribe now. I tell stories like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens after this moment. My hands trembled under the tablecloth. I had been holding a simple glass of water, but it might as well have been dynamite in my palm. The sweat made it slip, and it nearly tipped. My son's glare grew sharper, cutting deeper. I remembered the way he used to look at me when he was little, as if I were his whole world. That boy wasn't here anymore. In his place stood a man ashamed of my presence, desperate to erase me from the picture. The billionaire's lips pressed together, his face unreadable. He didn't speak yet, but his silence spoke louder than any voice in the room. I knew he had seen it all. The pointing finger, the insult, the cruelty of a son toward his father. I shifted in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me, echoing like an accusation. The guests whispered. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide. Another guest glanced at the billionaire, waiting for his reaction, as if he were the only judge that mattered. Inside me, shame wrestled with anger. I wanted to shout back at my son, to tell everyone there what I had given up for him, but my throat was locked. Words felt heavy, chained by years of sacrifice. The golden invitation still sat folded in my pocket. I had kept it like a treasure, though my name had never been printed on it. My wife had slipped it to me, whispering that our son needed support. I didn't realize then that I had been invited only out of obligation. His words still rang in my ears. "Don't embarrass me," as if my very existence was a stain, as if the wrinkles on my face, the calluses on my hands, were crimes he needed to hide. The billionaire's chair creaked again as he leaned forward. His eyes, sharp as steel, moved from my son to me. For a moment, the air froze. It felt like he was measuring us both on a scale invisible to everyone else. My son adjusted his suit nervously, pulling at the cuffs as if straightening the fabric could erase what had already been done. He smiled, forced and pale, pretending nothing had happened. But the mask was already cracked. I looked down at the polished cutlery, the silver knife glinting under the light. My reflection in its blade looked like a stranger, tired, small, unwanted. Memories of long nights driving trucks, skipping meals so my son could eat better, flashed before me. Each sacrifice suddenly felt like a wound he had just torn open in front of strangers. And yet, something flickered in the billionaire's eyes. Not just disappointment, not just judgment, something else. A recognition, a decision. One of the guests cleared his throat nervously, trying to break the silence. But no one dared speak over what was about to happen. Everyone sensed the storm. My son's fiancée reached for his hand under the table, squeezing it with desperation. She knew the damage was done. Her eyes darted toward me, almost apologetic, almost pleading. I gripped the edge of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white. The wood dug into my palm, grounding me in that humiliating moment. I wanted to stand, but my body betrayed me, heavy with grief. And then the billionaire rose to his full height. The room seemed to shrink. His voice had not yet broken the silence, but the very act of standing was enough to turn every gaze toward him. My son forced a laugh. Dad was just joking, he muttered, trying to sweep the cruelty under the rug. But his voice cracked, and the billionaire's eyes narrowed. I knew then, this wasn't about business anymore. This was about something deeper, something my son could never buy with his money or charm. The billionaire lifted his glass of wine, staring into the deep red swirl. He let it hover there, not drinking, not moving, as if deciding whether to toast or to condemn. I braced myself. Whatever he was about to say, it would not just fall on my son. It would fall on me, too. My dignity, my silence, my years of being invisible, all of it was about to be judged in front of 50 people. The chandelier flickered above us, the lights dimming for half a second, as if the house itself sensed what was coming. And then, finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, and it cut through the silence like a blade. Now I see who you really are. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my son, and my son's face went white. The glass slipped from his hand. It shattered against the floor, and every guest jumped in their seat. That was the moment the night turned into something none of us could have imagined. The sound of glass shattering still echoed in my mind as I sat frozen at that table, but my heart carried me back to years before, to nights when my son was just a boy, and I was nothing but a man with calloused hands and empty pockets. I can still feel the steering wheel of the truck vibrating under my fingers, the roads stretching endlessly before me, headlights cutting through the fog while the world slept. Every mile I drove, every hour I spent away from home, it was all for him, so he would never feel the hunger or fear that I knew too well. Those nights smelled of diesel and stale coffee, and my body ached with fatigue. But I told myself the sacrifices were worth it. I remember whispering promises into the dark cab. One day, he'll be proud. One day, he'll know what his father gave him. I traded birthdays, holidays, and dinners for paychecks, and though my bed was often cold, the thought of his future kept me warm. I would arrive home at dawn sometimes, boots heavy with dust, to find him still asleep, curled up with his stuffed bear. I'd stand in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of his small chest, and in those quiet moments, I felt I had everything. It didn't matter if I was exhausted. The sight of him safe and dreaming was enough. I wanted his world to be lighter than mine had ever been. There were nights when my wife begged me to rest, to take a shift off, but I couldn't. How could I? College wasn't going to pay for itself, and dreams don't come cheap. I carried the weight of his future on my shoulders, and though the burden nearly broke me, I wore it like armor. I was willing to be the invisible foundation if it meant he could stand tall above me. I remember one particular winter. The pipes in our house froze, and money was tighter than ever. My hands cracked from the cold, bleeding onto the steering wheel as I drove, but I kept going. That Christmas, I couldn't afford gifts for anyone else, but I bought him the book he wanted so badly. When he tore the paper open and his eyes lit up, I felt rich, richer than any man in that dining hall years later. As he grew older, the sacrifices grew with him. Private tutors, school trips, new clothes to fit in with the wealthier kids. I stretched every paycheck, pulled every string, sometimes skipped meals myself, just to make sure he wouldn't have to feel embarrassed around his friends. I thought I was building him wings, but I didn't see the walls rising between us. He rarely asked how I was, but I didn't expect him to. He was a boy chasing dreams, and I wanted him free of worry. I carried it all silently, swallowing the loneliness like bitter medicine. Each time he smiled, I convinced myself it was enough. That smile was my paycheck, my reward, my proof that none of my labor was wasted. When college acceptance letters arrived, I cried like a child. He thought I was being dramatic, but he didn't know how many nights I had prayed for that moment. I had driven through storms, slept in freezing cabins, eaten nothing but crackers, all so he could have this chance. And when I saw him holding that letter, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. But I also remember his words that day. He said, "Thanks, Mom," and then walked away. Not a glance at me. Not a word of gratitude. My wife caught my eyes and smiled softly, trying to cover the sting. I told myself he was young, distracted, overwhelmed. I told myself my time would come, that one day he would see. I believed in that future so fiercely that I ignored the cracks already forming. When he called late at night asking for more money, I never hesitated. Even when I had to sell my tools, even when I borrowed from neighbors, I answered with, "Of course, son." Each time I told myself it was temporary. Someday, he would stand before me with gratitude. The first time he told me not to come to an event, "Dad, maybe sit this one out," it was like a quiet knife sliding in. I laughed it off, pretended I didn't care, but inside, something trembled. Still, I excused him. He was growing, finding his place in the world. I convinced myself he was protecting me, not rejecting me. I remember waiting outside a restaurant once, watching through the glass as he dined with new friends, my face reflected faintly in the window. I was there because I had dropped off money he needed. He didn't invite me in. He didn't even wave. I stood in the cold until my feet went numb, then walked away. And yet, even in those moments, I kept believing that the sacrifices would bloom into respect, that the seeds I planted in sweat and silence would one day be seen. I told myself that love is patient, that time heals blindness, that blood remembers. That's why, when I stepped into that golden party with chandeliers and polished marble, I carried hope in my pocket, folded into that invitation. Even if my name wasn't printed, I thought my presence still mattered. I thought, maybe tonight, he would finally look at me and see the man who had built the ground he stood on. But the glare in his eyes, the words he spat, "Shut up, don't embarrass me," were proof that somewhere along the way, I had become not his foundation but his burden. The more I gave, the less he saw me. I was a ghost in his story, haunting the edges of his success. And as I sat there under the eyes of 50 strangers, the billionaire watching, my son pretending, I realized something I had never dared admit to myself. Maybe he was ashamed not of my poverty, not of my scars, but of me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sand. The weight of decades pressed on me, and I wondered, had I raised him for this? Had every mile, every sacrifice, every sleepless night brought me to this moment, where my son could erase me with a single shout? The billionaire's gaze lingered, piercing. I could feel it on me, but heavier on him. My son shifted, his facade cracking, sweat beading at his temple. The silence stretched, unbearable, until I feared I might scream, just to break it. And then the billionaire set down his glass with a deliberate thud, the sound echoing through the hall. His lips parted, and though his voice was calm, his words were aimed like a blade. He looked at my son, then at me, and said, "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" The room leaned forward. My son stiffened. My heart stopped, and in that breathless pause, I knew. The truth was about to spill, and it would burn more than any wine on the table. His question, "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" hung in the air like smoke, choking every corner of that dining hall. But before he answered, before judgment fell, my mind fled again to the first signs, the small cracks that had started years earlier. I had ignored them at the time, dismissing them as the awkwardness of youth, but now they returned, sharp and undeniable. The first time it happened, we were on our way to one of his high school events. He had begged me not to wear my old jacket, the one with grease stains from work. "Dad, can't you at least try to look normal?" he muttered, his eyes darting away. I laughed it off, told him I didn't have time to buy new clothes. But his silence afterward told me he wasn't joking. That silence was the seed of shame planted between us. Later, when he started hanging out with wealthier kids, he asked me not to come to his school presentations. It's better if Mom goes, he said, avoiding my eyes. I felt the words like cold water poured over me. Better if I stayed invisible. Better if I disappeared. And still, I told myself it was nothing. Just a boy embarrassed by his father's rough hands and tired face. I remember one evening, I drove him to a friend's birthday party. I pulled up in my old truck, the muffler rattling, and before I could stop, he jumped out, slamming the door quickly, as if to hide the vehicle. He didn't even say goodbye. I sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where he had vanished, the smell of oil and rust filling the cabin. My chest ached, but I swallowed it. I told myself it didn't matter. There were dinners where he would roll his eyes at my stories, as though my words embarrassed him more than they entertained. "Nobody cares about truck routes, Dad," he once said, laughing along with his friends. I smiled weakly, pretending I didn't mind, but inside I shrank smaller with every laugh that wasn't meant for me. That was when I began to realize he didn't see me as someone worth listening to anymore. It wasn't just words. It was gestures, too. The way he hurried ahead when we walked in public, never slowing to match my pace. The way he introduced me not as my father, but just, "This is my dad." His tone flat, almost apologetic. Each little moment was a cut, alone, survivable. Together, they bled me dry. One Christmas, he told me outright, "Don't come to the party at Sarah's. Her family is different. They're classy." He said the last word like it was a sword, slicing me neatly out of his life. I nodded, pretending to be busy, pretending not to care. But that night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from me, my chest heavy with a loneliness I couldn't describe. Even at home, he began to distance himself. He shut his door more often, laughed at jokes I didn't understand, spoke in a tone that made me feel like an outsider in my own house. I kept working, kept providing, hoping that my labor could somehow bridge the gap. But the more I gave, the less he seemed to see me. The day I found the golden party invitation with my name missing, it all made sense. It wasn't a mistake. It was the truth finally written in ink. I was never meant to be part of the world he was building. He had outgrown me, or maybe he believed he had, and still I clung to the hope that deep down, beneath the arrogance and distance, the boy who once held my hand in crowded streets still loved me. But love doesn't shout, "Shut up," in front of strangers. Love doesn't erase your name from the page. Love doesn't flinch at the sound of your voice as though it were a stain on the air. That night at the party, all the small humiliations I had endured in silence came crashing together like broken glass. I could see my younger self reflected in his eyes. The poor man, he didn't want anyone to notice. To him, I wasn't a father. I was a flaw, a weakness to be hidden in shadows. And what hurt most wasn't the words he used, but the ease with which he said them, like it was natural to discard me. The billionaire hadn't spoken yet, but he didn't need to. His gaze was already a sentence. My son didn't see it, but I did. I recognized it because I had seen that look in mirrors when I doubted myself, when I questioned whether my sacrifices had been enough. Now that same judgment had come for him, silent and heavy. And yet, even in my pain, part of me wanted to protect him. That's the curse of being a parent. Even when your child stabs you with words, you want to shield him from the world's knives. I wanted to lean forward, to tell the billionaire not to judge him too harshly, to remind him that youth can be cruel and blind. But my voice stayed locked. My son had already silenced me. I thought the humiliation had reached its peak, but then he did something worse. He laughed, not at me, but around me, pretending I wasn't even there. He cracked a joke for his friends, his voice loud and forced, while I sat invisible, burning in my own skin. That was when I realized indifference cuts deeper than insult. The billionaire's fingers tapped the stem of his glass, slow and deliberate. His eyes narrowed, moving between my son and me like a pendulum measuring truth. The hall was silent, waiting, the weight of his judgment about to fall. And just as I braced for it, he placed the glass down with a thud, leaned forward, and opened his mouth to speak. The billionaire's voice hadn't yet landed, but my thoughts raced to that golden invitation, the one that had burned a hole in my pocket all evening. When I first held it, I felt pride swell inside me, a shimmering card with embossed letters, the edges glinting under the lamp. But when I opened it, my heart cracked. My wife's name was there, my son's fiancé's parents were listed, even distant business partners. Mine? Absent. Not even a footnote. I wasn't meant to exist in that glittering room. I remember holding it under the kitchen light, running my fingers over the paper again and again, searching for my name like a fool searching for hope in ashes. My wife tried to soften it, saying maybe it was an oversight, maybe just a printer's error. But I knew better. Invitations are curated, chosen, designed with precision. My absence wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate erasure, neat and elegant. When I asked my son about it, he barely looked up from his phone. "You're still coming," he muttered, dismissive. "Mom wanted you there." Not him. Mom. The words stabbed sharper than any blade. He hadn't wanted me, but he couldn't refuse her insistence. That night I learned my seat at the table was charity, not honor. I was a guest only by force of another's will. The day of the party, I put on my cleanest shirt, the one I reserved for rare occasions. It smelled faintly of soap, though age had worn its fabric thin. Standing in front of the mirror, I told myself not to mind the wrinkles in my skin, the gray creeping into my hair. I told myself my son would see past it. He would see me, the man who built his tomorrow brick by brick. But as I stepped into the hall, the chandeliers blinding with light, I saw the way his eyes flicked over me. A flash of irritation, quickly buried under a practiced smile. To him, I was the stain on the marble floor, tolerated only because I couldn't be swept away. And the golden invitation in my pocket grew heavier with every glance that passed over me. I sat quietly through the courses, my fingers tracing the folded paper like a talisman, though it offered no comfort. Around me, the guests clinked glasses, laughed loudly, whispered about deals and vacations I couldn't imagine. I tried to blend in, to disappear into the fabric of the evening, but the truth sat in my pocket, reminding me with every heartbeat, "You don't belong here." My son approached me once before dinner, leaning close so no one else could hear. His smile was wide, but his words were cold. "Please, Dad, just don't say much tonight. Don't ruin this. This is important." Important. As though my mere presence was a threat. I nodded, swallowing the fire rising in my throat. I told myself I could endure one night of silence for his sake. Still, the humiliation clung to me like smoke. Every laugh I wasn't part of, every toast that excluded me, every sideways glance from his friends, it all reinforced what the invitation had already declared. I was invisible, tolerated, but never celebrated. My name missing on that card was the silent prelude to the words he would later shout. As the dishes were cleared, I thought about the countless times I had sacrificed my pride to give him more. The invitation was just paper, but it was proof, tangible and cruel, that my sacrifices had not made me honored. They had made me disposable. I gripped it tighter, wishing it would dissolve into dust, wishing I could erase the pain written in its silence. And yet, part of me still hoped that maybe the billionaire would see through the glitter, that he would recognize the man behind the missing name. Maybe he would understand the weight of that card, the insult hidden in its gold. I wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge what I had endured for the son who now dismissed me like a shadow. The billionaire's eyes lingered on me several times, longer than they lingered on others. It unsettled me, as if he could see not just the man at the table, but the paper in my pocket, the years behind my silence. His gaze was heavy, almost knowing. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered, was he seeing my absence more clearly than my presence? The laughter around me blurred. The clinking glasses became distant. All I could feel was the weight of that invitation pressing against my chest, burning through the fabric. I thought of tearing it in half, of standing up and shouting the truth. I was never wanted here. But I didn't. I stayed seated, my voice swallowed, my dignity gnawed piece by piece. My son, meanwhile, thrived in the spotlight. He paraded jokes, shook hands with men whose watches cost more than my house, and every gesture screamed desperation. He wanted the billionaire's approval like oxygen, and in his pursuit, I became not his father, but his liability. That golden card had already decided my role, the silent shadow. But shadows don't stay silent forever. As the billionaire finally set down his glass, his voice cutting through the air, I felt the weight of the invitation shift in my pocket, heavier, almost alive. And in that moment I realized the card wasn't just paper. It was evidence. Evidence of erasure. Evidence of shame. The billionaire looked directly at me before turning back to my son. His lips curved, not in a smile, but in something sharper, colder. And then he said words that froze every drop of wine, every flicker of laughter in the room. Sometimes, the names left off the list tell the real story. The billionaire's words echoed like thunder. Sometimes, the names left off the list tell the real story. My son's laugh faltered, his shoulders stiffening. He tried to mask it, brushing the comment aside with a joke, but his eyes darted nervously toward me. In that moment, I understood he felt the weight too, the weight of the erasure, the shame that had been neatly folded into that golden card. Before dinner truly began, he pulled me aside into a shadowed corner of the hall, away from curious ears. His breath smelled of wine. His hands trembled as he straightened his tie. "Dad, please," he whispered through clenched teeth, "don't say anything tonight. Don't ruin this for me. I've worked too hard." His tone wasn't pleading. It was commanding, as though I were an intruder about to wreck his empire. I stared at him, the boy I once carried on my shoulders to see fireworks, now looking at me like I was the fire he needed to extinguish. My chest tightened, but I nodded. What else could I do? I had swallowed silence for years. One more night would not kill me, or so I thought. Yet the humiliation of being treated like a danger at my own son's celebration clawed deeper than any wound. When we returned to the table, he kept glancing at me, as if I might explode at any second. His smile toward the guests was wide, but the corners of his mouth twitched with unease. He laughed louder, poured more wine, gestured with his hands as though bigger movements could distract from the tension simmering at his side. Every time I tried to open my mouth, he cut across me, changing the subject, his voice tight and rushed. The guests noticed. I saw the flicker of confusion in their eyes, the way some glanced at me and then back at him. It was impossible not to see the pattern. The son silencing his father. Some smirked, others whispered, but no one dared to speak aloud. Their silence hurt more than their judgment. It meant they agreed that I was not worth defending. I picked up my fork, tried to focus on the food, but every bite turned to ash in my mouth. My son's voice filled the room, boasting about deals he hadn't yet closed, cars he planned to buy, vacations he dreamed of. His words glittered, but they rang hollow. And still, I stayed silent, my tongue burning with all the stories I wasn't allowed to tell. At one point, an older man across the table asked me a question about where I was from. Before I could answer, my son's laugh cut through the air. "Oh, Dad doesn't like talking about that stuff. It's boring." He waved a dismissive hand, and the conversation moved on. My cheeks burned. I had become invisible, not just ignored, but erased in real time. And yet, the billionaire kept watching. His fork rested untouched on his plate, his eyes moving carefully between father and son. He said nothing, but his silence screamed. He was cataloging everything: the arrogance, the cruelty, the desperate need to shine at someone else's expense. My son thought he was impressing him, but every word was a nail sealing his own coffin. I wanted to stand, to leave, to escape the suffocating shame, but my legs refused to move. Pride anchored me. Dignity chained me. I would not give them the pleasure of seeing me flee. So I sat there, each second dragging like an hour, while the mask on my son's face began to crack under the billionaire's unyielding gaze. Then came the cruelest moment yet. My son leaned back in his chair, gesturing toward me with his glass as he spoke to the billionaire. "My dad doesn't really get this world," he said with a forced chuckle. "He's simple, you know? He's just here to support." The words sliced clean through me. Just here. Just simple. Just a ghost at the feast. The billionaire tilted his head, his expression unreadable, but the shift in the room was undeniable. Guests grew quiet, waiting for a reaction. My son, oblivious, kept talking, drowning in his own arrogance. I clenched the napkin in my lap so tightly the fabric tore. My silence had become complicity, and it was killing me. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't the only one losing dignity. My son was losing himself. Every word, every dismissal, every laugh at my expense. It stripped him, exposed him. And still, he didn't see it. He was too blind, too desperate for the billionaire's nod. The billionaire finally set his fork down, the metal clinking softly against porcelain. The sound was small, but it cut sharper than any voice. All eyes turned to him. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his gaze heavy on my son. I held my breath, knowing whatever came next would change everything. But before he could speak, my son's hand shot out, gripping my wrist under the table. His grip was tight, almost painful. "Please," he hissed, his smile still plastered for the guests. "Say nothing." His desperation bled through his polished exterior, and for the first time that night, I saw fear in his eyes. I looked at him, my son trembling behind his mask, and I understood. He wasn't just afraid of me embarrassing him, he was afraid of being revealed. And the billionaire, with his unblinking stare, was seconds away from tearing that mask off completely. The grip of his hand still burned on my wrist as the dishes shifted to the main course. He let go quickly, pretending nothing had happened, but the mark remained, invisible yet heavy. The chandelier lights flickered across his face, and I saw the sweat at his temples, the way his smile strained under the weight of performance. For the first time, his arrogance looked fragile. As the waiter poured wine, I tried to make casual conversation with the guest beside me, an older woman with pearls around her neck. I asked if she was enjoying the evening, but before she could answer, my son interrupted with a loud laugh. "Dad, really? Don't bore her with small talk," he said, his voice sharp beneath the mask of amusement. The woman's smile faltered. My chest tightened. Every attempt I made to exist, he smothered. If I asked for bread, he spoke over me. If I tried to comment on the meal, he cut me short with a joke. The table became his stage, and I was the prop he shoved into the shadows. With every interruption, the humiliation grew thicker, until it felt like smoke choking me from the inside out. The guests laughed with him, though uneasily. I could see some shifting in their chairs, avoiding my eyes. Others covered their discomfort with forced chuckles, choosing to side with power rather than with truth. Each laugh was a hammer, pounding me deeper into silence. I wanted to scream, but my voice drowned in shame. And yet, through it all, the billionaire sat silent. His knife lay untouched, his glass half full, his gaze steady. He didn't laugh, he didn't smile, he simply watched. Every harsh word my son threw, every laugh that followed, he absorbed it all like evidence, weighing it against the man desperately trying to impress him. I shifted in my chair, the wood pressing painfully into my back. My napkin lay crumpled in my lap, damp with sweat from my clenched hands. My pulse raced, each beat louder than the murmur of voices around me. This wasn't just dinner anymore. This was a trial, and the billionaire was judge, jury, and executioner. The cruelty escalated. At one point, my son mimicked my accent when I tried to speak, exaggerating it for laughs. A few guests chuckled nervously, but most looked down, ashamed. My face burned hotter than the candles flickering on the table. It wasn't just disrespect. It was betrayal, carved out in front of strangers. I stared at my plate, untouched. The food smelled rich, heavy with butter and spice, but my stomach churned. I remembered the nights when we had nothing, when I drove through storms just to put soup on the table. And now, here he was, mocking the voice that had sung him to sleep, the hands that had fed him, the man who had built his foundation. The billionaire finally leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. His eyes moved slowly across the table, but when they landed on me, I felt stripped bare. For a moment, I thought he might defend me, but he stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch, giving my son more rope to hang himself. It was a cruel mercy. The humiliation didn't stop with words. When I reached for the water jug, my son snatched it first, pouring for everyone else before shoving it back in my direction. His smirk was sharp, triumphant, as though he had scored another victory. The water sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the tablecloth. Nobody laughed this time. The air was too thick, too heavy. I realized then that this wasn't just a dinner. It was a countdown, a deadline. My son's arrogance had carried him to the edge, and the billionaire was letting him walk further, waiting for the inevitable fall. I could feel it in the air, like the seconds ticking before an explosion. The more he mocked me, the more frantic he became. His voice rose louder, his gestures wilder, his laugh shriller. He thought he was burying me, but in truth, he was burying himself. The guests saw it now. The whispers began. Heads tilted toward one another. Glances darted. The performance was unraveling. My son didn't notice. He was drunk on his own noise, his own need to shine. He clinked his glass against others, boasted about deals he hadn't closed, bragged about cars he didn't own. He laughed louder, harder, but each sound rang emptier, hollower. And still, the billionaire watched in silence, waiting. I sat frozen, torn between fury and sorrow. Every part of me wanted to shout, to break the silence with truth, to defend my dignity. But something stopped me, a strange calm, a certainty that I didn't need to speak, because someone else would, someone far more powerful. The billionaire leaned forward suddenly, resting his elbows on the table, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. "Do you know what I hear when you speak?" The room froze. My son blinked, caught off guard, his mouth still half open from his last laugh. And in that instant, I knew the countdown had reached 0. The billionaire's voice carried no anger, no raised tone, but it silenced the entire hall more effectively than a shout. "Do you know what I hear when you speak?" he repeated, his gaze fixed firmly on my son. Forks hovered mid-air. Wine glasses froze just short of lips. Even the waiters at the edges of the room stopped moving. The words hung there like a blade waiting to fall. My son stammered, his polished mask slipping. I just meant, I was only joking." His laugh was weak, brittle, the kind that cracked under pressure. His hand reached for his glass, but it trembled so badly the liquid inside rippled. For the first time that night, I saw fear flash across his face. Not fear of me, fear of being seen. The billionaire didn't smile. His expression was carved from stone, his eyes sharp, calculating. "I hear desperation," he said finally, his words steady. "I hear a man who believes he must step on others to rise. I hear someone who mistakes arrogance for confidence." His gaze shifted briefly to me, then back to my son. "And I wonder what you're really trying to hide." A murmur spread through the guests, soft but impossible to ignore. My son's cheeks flamed, his jaw clenched. "That's not true," he muttered, too quickly. His laugh returned, hollow and forced. "We're just having a good time, right? No harm." But his eyes darted around the table, searching desperately for support. None came. I felt a strange mixture in my chest. Shame, yes, but also something sharp and unexpected. Justice. For the first time, it wasn't me absorbing the blows. It was him, the man who had mocked me, silenced me, pushed me aside. Now he was the one cornered, exposed under a light he couldn't dim. My son tried to redirect, leaning toward the billionaire with a wide grin. "You know, sir, I really admire your work. I've studied your deals, your philosophy. I just want to learn from you, to be like you." His words spilled too fast, tripping over each other. But instead of admiration, the billionaire's expression only hardened further. "You want to be like me?" His voice was low, deliberate. "Then learn this. A man who humiliates his own father in front of strangers will humiliate anyone. A man who laughs at blood will never be trusted with loyalty. If you treat the one who gave you life like dirt, why would anyone else believe you'd treat them with respect?" The silence that followed was suffocating. My son's face went pale, his lips pressed together tightly. I could see his chest rising faster, the rhythm of panic setting in. He tried to speak, but no sound came. Around us, the guests avoided his eyes, ashamed to witness the unraveling. My heart thudded against my ribs. The billionaire wasn't just condemning him. He was stripping him bare, showing everyone the truth I had swallowed for years. And though part of me wanted to shield my son, another part whispered, "Finally. Finally, someone else sees it. Finally, someone else says it aloud." The billionaire leaned back, his gaze never leaving my son. "I came here tonight to see a man worthy of partnership," he said. "What I see is a boy desperate to hide behind wealth he hasn't earned. A boy who believes gold can cover rot." His words landed like hammer strikes, each one shattering the illusion my son had built. A gasp came from one corner of the room. My son's fiancée covered her mouth, her eyes glistening with something between shock and sorrow. She knew too. Perhaps she had always known. But this was the first time it had been spoken aloud in front of everyone. The truth was no longer private. It was public, undeniable. My son's hand slammed down on the table suddenly, the plates rattling. "That's enough!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I've worked for." But even as he said it, I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. The billionaire had cut too close. The mask couldn't hold. The guests sat frozen, torn between pity and discomfort. No one dared defend him. No one dared move. The man they had come to admire was dismantling my son piece by piece, and there was nothing to do but watch. Every second stretched long, heavy with tension. I gripped the golden invitation in my pocket, the edges cutting into my palm. For years it had symbolized my exclusion, my erasure, but now, in this moment, it felt like something else. Proof. Proof that the man tearing my son apart was right. The paper was more than a card. It was evidence of truth. And then, just as the silence reached its peak, the billionaire stood. His chair scraped back against the marble, sharp and final. He raised his glass, not for a toast, but for judgment. "The question," he said, his eyes narrowing, "is not whether you can impress me tonight. The question is, what happens when the mask finally falls?" The words sliced through the hall like lightning. My son's face drained of color. And then, with trembling hands, he turned his glare on me. His eyes filled not with shame, but with fury. Fury that I existed. Fury that I had been the mirror he could not escape. And I knew then, the worst was still to come. My son's glare cut through me like a knife, his eyes blazing with anger he couldn't unleash at the billionaire. Instead, he turned it on me, his safest target. His lips curled into a snarl, his hand slamming the table again as he spat the words that silenced every whisper in the room. "Just shut up! You always ruin everything!" His voice echoed under the chandelier, cruel and raw. I hadn't even spoken. Not a word. I sat frozen, napkin twisted in my lap, while 50 faces turned toward me, some with pity, others with horror. The heat rushed into my cheeks, and for a second I thought I might choke. After all these years, all my silence, he had managed to humiliate me without me even opening my mouth. The billionaire's chair creaked as he stood again, his eyes narrowing, his lips pressed into a thin line. The hall went still, the kind of silence that vibrates in your bones. He placed his napkin on the table with slow precision, the sound of the fabric hitting the wood louder than thunder. And then his voice cut through the room. "Now I see who you really are." My son's bravado cracked in an instant. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw trembled. "You don't understand," he tried, his tone desperate now. He's nothing. He doesn't get this world. I'm the one who—" But he stopped himself too late, the words spilling poison into the very air he
Every
needed
guest heard.
to breathe. Every guest understood. I gripped the edges of my chair, torn between shame and a twisted sense of justice. For years I had borne his disdain in private, telling myself it was immaturity, that he would grow out of it. But now, stripped of his mask, he revealed the truth. It wasn't immaturity. It was who he had chosen to become. And everyone saw it. The billionaire's eyes didn't leave him. "You think wealth hides character," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "but it only magnifies it. Tonight you tried to impress me with arrogance. Instead, you've shown me the kind of man I would never trust." His tone wasn't angry. It was final. Gasps rippled down the table. A fork clattered to the floor, loud in the silence. My son's fiancée looked down at her hands, her knuckles white around the stem of her glass. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. The truth hung too heavily in the air, undeniable now. My son's voice rose, frantic, cracking under the weight. "You don't understand what I've done. The deals I've set up. The people I know." He waved his hands wildly, knocking over a glass of wine, the red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. He didn't notice. He was unraveling, piece by piece, in front of everyone. The billionaire didn't flinch. He simply pushed the glass aside, with calm precision, as though nothing mattered less than my son's chaos. "Respect," he said quietly, "cannot be bought. And a man who cannot honor the one who gave him life will never honor anyone else. Remember that." His words landed heavier than any shout. I lowered my gaze, shame and relief battling inside me. Relief that someone else had finally spoken the truth I had carried in silence. Shame that it had come to this, that my son's cruelty had to be displayed like theater for all to see. My heart ached, but it also hardened. Perhaps this was the only way he would ever face himself. The guests whispered now, no longer hiding their judgment. Some shook their heads, others avoided his eyes entirely. The illusion had shattered. My son wasn't the charming host anymore. He was a desperate man exposed, stripped of his carefully polished mask, and everyone knew it. He slammed his fist down again, veins bulging at his temples. "You don't get to judge me," he shouted at the billionaire, his voice raw. "I built this. I earned this." But the billionaire didn't move. His silence was judgment enough. My son's words rang hollow, empty in the vast hall. I looked at him, my boy, my blood, the child I had sacrificed my life for, and all I saw was a stranger, a man so terrified of being small that he crushed the very people who lifted him, a man who thought silencing me made him stronger, when in truth it only revealed his weakness. The billionaire slowly turned to the room, his hand resting on the back of his chair. "We can end this charade now," he said calmly. "There is no partnership here. There never will be. His eyes returned to my son, sharp as steel. And I advise you to think carefully about the kind of man you still have time to become, before it's too late. My son's face drained of color. He staggered back from the table, knocking into a chair. His eyes darted wildly, from the billionaire to the guests to me. And then, finally, they landed squarely on me, blazing, furious, desperate. It was no longer the look of a son to a father. It was the look of a man searching for someone to blame. And in that moment, I knew. He had chosen his enemy. Not the billionaire who rejected him, not the guests who whispered. Me, his father. His fury locked on me like a predator to prey. And the night was about to turn darker than anything I had imagined. The moment his eyes locked on mine, I felt the room shrink. 50 people sat frozen, but it was as if there were only two of us, father and son, predator and prey. His chest heaved, his jaw clenched, and in that silence I recognized something far worse than shame. It was hatred, not of the billionaire, not of the guests, but of me, the man who had given him everything. He stepped closer, his voice sharp, trembling with fury. "This is your fault," he hissed, though everyone could hear. "You shouldn't even be here. You've ruined everything." His words were a knife twisted in my chest, years of sacrifice erased with a single accusation. For a moment, I thought my knees might give way, but I stayed seated, my back rigid, refusing to crumble in front of strangers. The billionaire cut in, his voice calm but deadly. "Enough," he said. "Blame won't save you. Respect will, and you've shown none." His words carried weight heavier than any fist. My son faltered, his breath catching, but then his arrogance returned like a mask he couldn't let go of. He raised his voice, desperate now. "You don't know him. He's nothing. He drove trucks his whole life. That's all he is." The hall gasped. A woman dropped her fork, the sound sharp as glass breaking. My throat burned, but I said nothing. I let the silence speak for me. I let the billionaire's gaze burn into him instead, because every word he spat about me was not my humiliation anymore. It was his undoing. The billionaire leaned forward, his eyes hard as steel. "If he is nothing, then you are less, because a man who disowns the very hands that raised him will never rise. He will only fall." The words struck like thunder. My son paled, his lips parting in shock, but no defense came. The room was a jury, and the verdict was already written on their faces. Still, he tried to laugh, tried to wave it away. "Come on," he said, voice cracking. "You all don't understand. He doesn't belong here." His eyes darted to the billionaire. "I belong here. With you. With this world." But no one nodded. No one smiled. The weight of their silence crushed him. I watched him crumble, and my heart tore in two. Part of me wanted to reach out, to remind him that no matter what, he was my son. But another part whispered the truth. He had chosen this path. He had turned me into a ghost long before tonight, and ghosts cannot save the living. The billionaire rose, lifting his glass, his voice carrying across the hall. "If a man cannot respect his own father," he said, "then he will never respect a partner, a client, or a friend. Tonight, I reject not only your proposal, but the man you have shown yourself to be." His glass clinked back onto the table, final as a gavel. My son's face drained of all color. He swayed on his feet, gripping the back of a chair for balance. "You can't do this," he whispered, but his voice held no conviction. He looked around the hall, desperate for support, but no one met his eyes. Even his fiancée turned away, tears streaking down her face. The silence stretched, suffocating. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, every beat screaming with both sorrow and vindication. For years, I had been silenced. Now his own words had silenced him. And for the first time, the truth wasn't mine alone to bear. The whole world had seen it. But he wasn't done. He spun toward me, his face twisted with rage, his voice breaking. "Are you happy now?" he shouted. "Is this what you wanted? To humiliate me? To destroy me?" His finger jabbed the air, pointing straight at my chest. The room recoiled, but I sat still, my hands trembling under the table. I opened my mouth, ready to speak for the first time that night, but no words came. The weight of decades pressed against my throat. I wanted to tell him I had never wanted his destruction, only his love, but the silence was too heavy, too final. My son saw it as guilt, and his fury only deepened. He slammed his fist onto the table so hard that glasses toppled, wine spilling like blood across the white cloth. "You think you're better than me?" he screamed. "You think you deserve respect just because you wasted your life working like a dog?" His voice cracked, desperate, ugly. The mask was gone. Only raw anger remained. The billionaire's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady. "Enough!" But this time, my son didn't listen. His eyes were wild, his chest heaving, and as he leaned forward, his words spit with venom, I knew something darker was coming. Something that would make everything that had already happened feel like only the beginning. Because in that moment, staring into his furious eyes, I realized the son I had raised was gone, and the man standing before me was capable of far worse than words. His chest rose and fell like a storm contained in flesh, and for a moment I feared he might cross the table, that he might lay hands on me in front of everyone. The guests held their breath, forks frozen in mid-air, eyes wide. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I stayed seated, still, unflinching, because I realized then nothing he could do would wound me more than he already had. The billionaire's voice cut through the tension, firm as stone. "Enough." This time it was a command. It wasn't a warning. My son stopped, his body trembling, his lips twitching as though he wanted to argue, but the power in that single word silenced him. The hall seemed to exhale, but the weight in my chest only grew heavier. I rose slowly from my chair, my hands steady, my legs sure. The room seemed to tilt, but I forced myself upright. I looked at my son, his face pale and contorted, and for the first time in years I saw him not as a child, not as my boy, but as a man standing in ruins he had built with his own hands, and the ruins looked nothing like me. I wanted to reach out, to comfort, to shield him from the judgment pressing in from every side. But I didn't, because love is not silence when silence becomes a weapon. Love, sometimes, is truth spoken in the rawest form, and tonight the truth was already carved into the walls of this hall. I took a deep breath and spoke, my voice low but steady. "I have nothing to be ashamed of," I said. The words weren't meant for him alone. They were meant for everyone watching, for every laugh that had cut me down, for every whisper that had erased me. I worked. I sacrificed. I gave my son everything I could. And if that makes me less in his eyes, then so be it. But it will never make me small. A ripple moved through the room. Some lowered their heads, others blinked rapidly, unable to meet my eyes. My son froze, his mouth open, no words spilling out this time. For once, it was he who was silenced, and the silence was louder than his shouts. The billionaire nodded once, slowly, his gaze fixed on me. "That," he said, "is dignity, and dignity can never be bought or sold." His words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, reaching every guest at the table. My son's head dropped, his shoulders collapsing inward. I turned then, my steps slow, deliberate, walking toward the doors at the far end of the hall. Each step felt lighter, though the years of sacrifice still clung to my bones. I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking away free, free of his shame, free of his judgment, free of the chains of silence I had carried for too long. Behind me, I heard whispers, the scrape of chairs, the clink of glasses. But I didn't stop. For once, I didn't need to, because the story was no longer mine to defend. It was his to carry. The wreckage, the humiliation, the truth. He would have to live with it, and I would no longer bear it for him. The cool air outside struck my face, sharp and cleansing. I lifted my head toward the night sky, the stars blurred with tears I didn't wipe away. They weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of release. For the first time in years, I felt taller, as though the weight pressing me down had finally slipped free. I thought of the long nights behind the wheel, the miles of asphalt stretching beneath me, the cracked hands, the empty dinners. For so long I had believed those sacrifices were wasted, but now I saw it differently. They had built me, even if he refused to see it. They had given me dignity, and dignity is worth more than gold. I knew then that my son's journey was not over. He still had time, still had chances, still had choices to make. Perhaps one day he would remember. Perhaps one day he would knock on my door, humbled, seeking the father he had tried so hard to erase. Perhaps. But that was no longer my burden to hope for. I walked home that night, with my head high, each step a promise to myself. I would no longer beg for respect. I would no longer hide in shadows. If my son could not see my worth, others would. I would see it myself, and that was enough. Because money buys attention, but not love. Wealth buys a seat at the table, but not dignity. And though he had chosen shame, I had chosen truth. Truth cannot be silenced forever. Truth always rises, even when shouted down. As I reached my door, I turned one last time, imagining the hall still buzzing with whispers, the billionaire's words still hanging heavy in the air. My son's face, pale and broken, flickered in my mind. But instead of pain, I felt only clarity. And in that moment, I realized something I had never dared believe before. I was not the one who had lost a son. He was the one who had lost a father. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the price that finally made him see. What would you have done differently? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your truth too. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because the next story I'll share is even more unbelievable than this one.